What is emotional eating and why we can't really separate emotions from eating? Why overeating is not the same like binge eating, and why almost everyone ends up overeating sometimes. We're going to cover all that and more in today's episode, so stay tuned. My name is Anna, but you can call me Anchi, and I'm a host of the Binge on Self-Love podcast, where I share my eating disorder recovery journey, my journey to self-acceptance, and where I talk to interesting guests who share their stories. So without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Binge on Self-Love podcast is intended for informational purposes only. It doesn't provide professional medical advice, and it is not a substitute for diagnosis or treatment. Before we start, there are 3 important things that I want to highlight today. Number 1 is that if you would like to get access to more content about recovery, self-acceptance, self-love, make sure to follow Binge on Self-Love on Instagram and TikTok. Number 2 is that if you struggle with disordered eating or an eating disorder, or you think you may be struggling with it, please never ever feel ashamed to ask for help. Don't hesitate to reach out to a professional who's going to talk to you about everything you're going through and who's going to advise you on what are the best options for you to recover and to heal your relationship with your body and with food. And number 3 is that I'm not an expert on eating disorders, and I'm not claiming to be. I'm just someone who's struggled with it. So for creating today's episode, I've used a lot of available resources, which I'll mention throughout the episode, and I'll also link them in the show notes. First, let's talk about emotional eating. Emotional eating, also sometimes called stress eating or comfort eating, is something that I dare to say almost all of us encountered either among other people or we've experienced it ourselves. You've probably heard people say things like, eating up my emotions, or pizza and ice cream are my comfort foods. However, psychotherapist Paula Atkinson mentions in an article by Everyday Health that there's no way we wouldn't have or that we wouldn't feel an emotional connection to eating. And that's because emotions are part of pretty much everything we do. It's human nature, and we feel some emotion pretty much all day, every day. So we eat when we're happy, we eat when we're sad, we eat when we're stressed, we eat when we feel any other way. So it doesn't mean that emotional eating is necessarily a bad thing rather than a natural thing that we do. And besides eating being closely tied to emotions, it is also an act of social interaction, like family gatherings, celebrations, holidays. So when we're having these interactions, we're feeling a lot of emotions, and oftentimes we're also eating while having these interactions and while feeling all these emotions. But according to Eating Disorder Help, frequent emotional eating can, quote-unquote, cause an unhealthy cycle of using food to cope with negative feelings and then feeling guilt and shame. What I personally, and don't quote me on that because I'm not an expert, but what I personally think is the problem is when you have no other healthier ways and coping mechanisms how to deal with your emotions and how to deal with strong feelings other than reaching out to food. Because food is not going to solve our problems. What I also think can be a little tricky is that when you continue to eat because you feel certain emotions and you want to hush those emotions and you want to push those feelings aside, that after some time, you may kind of find it difficult to differentiate between when you're actually hungry and when you feel this kind of emotional hunger. But on the other hand, I also don't think that when we eat as a consequence of feeling certain emotions, that we are always going to end up overeating. I don't think that's necessarily always the case. One important thing is that emotional eating is not a clinical term. It's not something that you can get diagnosed with. It is not an eating disorder. And also, emotional eating isn't the same as overeating. Overeating is something that, again, many of us have experienced ourselves. You can think of family gatherings or Christmas, when many of us eat way beyond the feeling of fullness. Or you can think of having a second helping, third helping, then maybe even a dessert and a coffee or something else. And before you know it, you feel really full and you realize that you've eaten probably more than you would normally do on any given day. Or you can think of a situation when you eat food that's really rare for you, like a birthday cake or a Christmas dinner, simply something we eat like once or twice a year. And it's not really surprising that when we're enjoying that food and it's really rare and we have it only on rare occasions, that we may end up overeating on it. Based on Brave Space Nutrition article, there's not one agreed upon definition of overeating, and therefore overeating can be slightly differently understood by different people. Plus, the feeling of overeating is also highly subjective because we all have different needs, and someone may start feeling full really soon after they start eating, whereas someone else can have a second helping and they still feel like they could keep eating. The important fact is that almost all of us overeat sometimes, and it's not usually something that would affect us in a negative way and that would keep our minds ruminating on the fact that we overate for a long period of time. If we compare overeating with binge eating and binge eating disorder, overeating doesn't happen regularly or often. The speed in which we eat also doesn't play a role in overeating, whereas in the case of binge eating or a binge eating disorder, we tend to eat a large amount of food in a very short period of time, and we tend to do it in private, whereas with overeating, it can happen at any time. You can overeat during a work lunch, or you can overeat at a family gathering because there's a lot of delicious food that you just want to taste. According to Walden Eating Disorders article, when we overeat, we may feel a little guilty, but not to an extreme level, like in case of binge eating disorder. When I was struggling with binge eating disorder and I've tried to explain to someone who didn't know anything about it, usually the reaction that I would get would be something like, "Oh, but I also overeat sometimes, like that's normal." Yeah, overeating is normal. Everyone overeats sometimes, but overeating and binge eating disorder are not the same. So now let's look at binge eating and binge eating disorder. Binge eating is characterized by eating a large amount of food in a short period of time, like I've mentioned, eating way past point of fullness, often to a point of a physical pain. It's characterized by eating alone, eating in a privacy, hiding from other people, eating faster than usual, and also feeling like you're lacking control over eating, feeling like you just can't stop eating. And all that is often followed by feelings of guilt and shame, or feelings of embarrassment, or feeling disgusted with yourself. But unlike binge eating disorder, binge eating is usually lower in frequency and duration. And also the difference between binge eating and binge eating disorder is that binge eating disorder is a diagnosable eating disorder. Binge eating, on the other hand, is a disordered eating, which the National Eating Disorders Collaboration article describes as a spectrum between normal eating and eating disorder. I don't personally like the phrase normal eating because normal is very subjective. What is normal, what's not? But for the sake of this episode, let's stick with normal. According to DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a publication by the American Psychiatric Association used for classification of mental disorders, there are different sets of criteria for diagnosing binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder occurs at least once a week for at least 3 months, or at least twice a week for at least 6 months. You're eating a large amount of food in a short period of time, and the large amount is considered large compared to what most people would eat in a similar period of time. Another criteria is feeling a lack of control over eating during the binge eating episode. Also, you're usually eating faster than you normally would. You're eating past your point of fullness. You're eating alone, and you may experience feelings of guilt and disgust with yourself after the binge eating episode. Another criterion is that you're not using any inappropriate compensatory behaviors on a regular basis, like purging, excessive exercise, or fasting. Then there are different levels of severity associated with it, depending on the frequency of the binge eating episodes. Binge eating can turn into binge eating disorder. And I'm not sure if you know that, but binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder. According to an article on Eating Disorder Hope, binge eating disorder is actually 3 times more common than anorexia and bulimia combined. So as you can see, binge eating disorder and binge eating and overeating and emotional eating are just not the same. Probably all of us eat in response to some emotions at some point. Pretty much all of us have overeaten or will overeat at some point. Binge eating is disordered eating, and binge eating disorder is an actual eating disorder. So that's something you can get diagnosed with. I try to look into the most common causes of binge eating disorder and of binge eating. Of course, there are plenty of them. This list is not exhaustive at all, but one of those reasons, and I would say probably a very common one, is that it is a consequence of dieting. When you are restricting yourself of certain foods or you are restricting the amount of food that you eat, then you start to feel these different cravings and you try to ignore them. But after some time, when you can no longer ignore those cravings, or after you go off of the diet, you may overindulge in the food that you've been restricting yourself of, and then you may start feeling shame or disgust or like you failed, so you decide to go on a diet again, or you decide to restrict what you eat. And if you keep repeating this over time, it can become this cycle where you restrict yourself, then you binge, then you feel ashamed, and then you restrict again, and you keep repeating this twisted, wicked cycle. And this cycle can lead to developing binge eating and binge eating disorder. That's why I no longer do any stupid diets. I am totally against dieting. I don't like it. I don't think that we should be restricting food groups from our diets. On the contrary, I think that our diets should be rich in a lot of different foods and food groups, and we shouldn't turn certain food groups into evil, something that we need to avoid at all costs and something that we can only eat on a specific time, something like a cheat meal or whatever. I don't like these things at all. Another causes that can contribute to developing binge eating or binge eating disorder can be negative body image, again, something that so many of us experience. It can be genetics, it can be emotional trauma, and it can be so many other things. One personal experience that I would like to mention is that how you can differentiate between occasionally overeating and binge eating disorder is how much it actually interferes with your life. I was struggling with binge eating disorder for many years, and at some point, binge eating disorder totally consumed my life. There was no space for anything else. I was either binge eating or thinking about binge eating or wishing to stop binge eating and heal from binge eating. So what I want to say is that there is a very big difference between emotional eating, overeating, binge eating, and binge eating disorder, and that it's really important that we don't interchange all of these terms. However, one really important thing that I want to leave you with is that it doesn't matter what issue you're struggling with. If it's affecting you in a negative way and you don't know what to do, you deserve support no matter what issue you have or no matter where on that spectrum you are. So I just want you to never feel ashamed or embarrassed to ask for help. There are plenty of resources available, and I'm going to link some of those in the show notes, so please feel free to check them out. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Like I said, if you would like to get more content related to self-love, self-acceptance, eating disorder recovery, please don't hesitate to follow Binge on Self-Love on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care and talk to you soon.